Welcome everyone to the final FutureDAMS webinar. I'm David Hume, the CEO of FutureDAMS, and we're using this session to try and pull things together after 4.5 years of research, capacity development, and trying to have impact at times on what's been happening in the world. And what we're going to do in this final session is give a chance for a number of partners to reflect on what they've learned through the research and the capacity development programs that we've been running. We're going to try and do that very much in a nutshell format, and people will have 3 minutes to give sort of 3 comments that hopefully will help us get the major lessons that they've learned. And we're asking the question: what is the future of dams? What is the future of these major interventions and investments in water, energy, food, environment, Nexus programs? So we're trying to pull things together after the many very different things that we've done. Just before we move on to that, there is some housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded, but we won't record the question and answers. If you want to ask a question or make a comment, and we very much welcome that, then if you submit those through chat to Rob Dorber, or when we move to having audience participation, if you raise your hand, we'll be able to allocate you the microphone. At the end of the, after the session, there'll be an edited recording of the webinar, and that will include slides and links. It will have details of any of the websites that we're suggesting you might want to look at in the future, and that will be circulated to everyone who's registered for the event. But just to give you an idea about what we're going to do, we're going to start off with the 3 directors, myself, Julian Harrow, and Jamie Skinner, drawing together a few conclusions that we've had when we've been directing the program and leading it. We then move on to a series of partners, and we're trying to get them from a spread of disciplines, from a spread of different basins that they're looking at, and from a spread of different positions in their career. There are some grey-haired people like me, but we've also got early career researchers and postgraduate research assistants. After we've heard from those partners, then we'll have 20 to 30 minutes for the audience, the other people who are tuning in, to ask the questions or to make comments. And we'd particularly welcome advice about if you've spotted any major finding we've had, or any message that comes clearly out of our research, whether there is some synthetic, some overarching message. And then we'll finish off with some final thoughts from myself and Julian on how the program's run, and from other partners if they want to come in on that. We'll close the session at 4:30, but just to remind all the FutureDAMS partners, if you can stay on after 4:30, then we can take 25-30 minutes just to say cheerio to each other and reflect on what we've been doing over the last 4.5 years. And there's a special award for whoever can remember the best FutureDAMS joke, if anybody can remember when something disastrous happened and we had to laugh at ourselves. Okay, well, I'm going to give most of the time to Julian and Jamie because they've been running the research and running the capacity development. But certainly just 2 or 3 things that I've noticed, observed, or felt were important. I mean, the first one is, I thought infrastructure decisions and major investments like this were quite difficult, but I think I now believe they are acts of faith, because the future is so uncertain that it is extremely difficult to try and work out what a major investment is actually going to contribute in the future. We can see that with the dams that we've been looking at now, but I think our work looking at colonial India looked at the way that what might have been a low return investment in dams by the colonial government in India eventually supported the Green Revolution. But that was obviously, the infrastructure was built by people who had no idea about a green revolution. The second thing, and it comes out a little bit in the presentations we've got, is just how once you move into these engineering and technical areas, how male dominated they remain. And we've been really trying over the whole period of FutureDAMS to try to move a little bit towards gender equality in presentations, in involvement, in publications, but it is still clearly the case that these fields are very much male dominated, and we need to try and find ways of ensuring that more female contributors are interested in these topics and are able to develop academic or professional careers in the field. And the final point I'll make at this stage is just to sort of say something that I'll repeat at the end, but it is that we hope this doesn't, this session is not your last interaction with FutureDAMS. We will be continuing, some of us as individuals, some of us as new forms of institutional organization, with the sorts of work that we've been doing, with the technical modeling work and with the political economy work. There's going to be a whole series of further publications and blogs that will go onto the website, which will be live for the next several months, particularly work on our case studies still to come out, and some advances with the modeling. And after the FutureDAMS website has become a legacy website, there are two websites I think that Julian will tell you about, Water Strategy and Nexus Strategy websites, that will be taking forward the work, providing software and providing training materials about the modeling of major investments in WEFE Nexus systems. So we hope you found it useful engaging with us, and please do keep an eye on what we're doing, because although in theory our funding, our funding has finished in practice. In theory, our work should finish, but there's a lot of work that will go on in taking forward some of the findings we've had and analyzing some of the materials that we still haven't had time to analyze. Okay, well, let's pass it over to Julian now, I think, who is coming to us from Belgium today. Over to you, Julian.
Okay, thanks. And I'll ask Rob to show those slides. I think the first one, I just wanted to have a kind of philosophical moment to reflect on what we started out doing. This slide here is the original figure in the proposal. You can ignore the names because a lot of the researchers changed, but this was kind of the ambition that we started out with in FutureDAMS. It was really to look at dams was really the hydraulic structure was a case study. It was really about the assessment of complex interventions in human natural systems, so water, energy, food, megasystems, and how does one assess and design those interventions. And dams, hydraulic reservoirs, have been a great case study, but I think intellectually we were more ambitious, and I think to some extent we've succeeded. You see here there's 6 areas of scholarship. Some of these, well, there were certainly people involved in all of these elements. We had sometimes more success than others in linking them all together. We wanted to link them all together into one big coherent approach to make recommendations on interventions in water, energy, food, environment, large systems. And it was difficult to bring all 6. I think perhaps social impacts is the one that we struggled the most with. Governance is also difficult, but we did produce a guidance manual that was led by people in GDI on how to implement the kind of information and analytics type engineering and economics type assessment methods. So I think everyone was able to pull together and to work together relatively well. Some of the contributions were definitely just disciplinary contributions, and so we had a range of papers, but we did produce quite a bit of joint work, and that has resulted in a framework and a tool set that allows to assess and even optimize some of these interventions. So by and large, I would say we were successful in FutureDAMS, and I think the 3-4 minute talks given by some key researchers will hopefully provide testimony to that. The next slide shows the and of course in that previous slide we had our 4 case studies, which are shown here. That's okay. Thanks, Rob. You can go to the map now. So this another part of the ambition of FutureDAMS was this pretty exciting set of case studies. We had the Volta River Basin in West Africa, the Nile River Basin in East Africa, the Tigris Euphrates in the Middle East, and then the entire country of Myanmar. In some cases, the scope of these enlarged or retracted somewhat. In the Volta River Basin, we ended up working more at the level of Ghana. In the Nile Basin, we ended up moving away from the Nile River Basin, which is a smaller set of countries, to all the countries of the East African Power Pool, which is well over 10. So, we were flexible. We adapted to the people that we worked with. Our partners were fantastic. They really, we had to find a different way of working with them in each of the case studies. The Tigris Euphrates work ended up being slightly different. That was more of an academic exercise because we were unable to find government partners because of the conflicts in that region. Also, Myanmar was a bit shocking in that we started out, with institutional structures in Myanmar, which then ceased to exist partway through the program. So it was definitely a lesson of change and evolution. I think for me, the biggest overall point is that, we were creating a product and an approach in FutureDAMS that doesn't really have a client, and that's always difficult. So if you will, there's no ministry or there's no utility or there's nobody who does and asks for water, energy, food, environment expertise and analysis, because no single institution, except maybe finance ministries or central governments, acts across all those areas at the same time. So I think the future, the last philosophical point, to finish on from FutureDAMS, is that we've built an approach and a tool set for a set of stakeholders who don't really exist yet. And that's people who look at strategic level how water, energy, food, environment systems interact and how they produce socioeconomic benefits for their populations. And, I think that's a sobering thought. I think in FutureDAMS, we've had some success in creating that future client, but it's been relative, and hopefully things will evolve so that there will be an agency in the future that does this kind of work. The next slide shows some of the efforts we made. One thing we did is that we said, if you want to, if you build it, they will come. I don't remember which film that was from, but there's a film that says, if you want there to be a client, we'll put out the product, put out the tool set that client will be able to use to empower them. And so we created this neat online website, which actually allows you to build river basin models online. And that's a really exciting thing. It worked great in the pandemic, where we could share tools together and work together with our partners. This was an exciting and ambitious thing. But the next slide shows a sister product to this one, which you can see the website name. So the first one's called waterstrategy.org, and this next one's called nexusstrategy.org. But they're essentially the same thing. You can build a river basin model, when I say river basin, that's something that includes the water system, the food production system, the energy system, the environmental and ecological system. And then in the Nexus strategy, we also include the power system. So you can see in this screenshot, you can see the national power system, transmission system of Ghana in red, and the water and environment and food and irrigated agricultural system in gray. And so these are exciting products. And the final slide shows the kind of graphics. So we're hoping that FutureDAMS will have a legacy, in that we've created, in our effort to create this future client, we have created almost like a consumer product to allow them to do their job. But will that client ever come to exist? Will anyone ever care about water, energy, food, environment systems? I don't know. We'll see. Maybe that will be, if they do, maybe FutureDAMS.org would have helped them out. I guess we'll see it. Maybe all of you can reflect on that in your upcoming slides. I'm sure that Jamie will, who's speaking next. So thanks everyone. It was great interacting with all the researchers and the stakeholders.
So we're now going to get a video from Jamie Skinner, who has decided, who retired on the day that the program closed. So Jamie is has luckily recorded a message for us.
Morning, everybody. I'm very sorry I can't be with you for this final webinar, but at least I have the opportunity to record a few thoughts as we come to the end of this 4-year process that has brought us all together. I certainly think it's been a very, very worthwhile process that has done a number of key things, and the most important one for me has been the capacity of our software teams to deliver on one of the big things that the World Commission on Dams asked for 20 years or so ago now, which is an opportunity to look fundamentally at different alternatives in the water and energy planning system, and to not just end up in a situation where a large water intervention, normally a dam, was very much seen as a shall we build it or shall we not build it choice, rather than asking the question of, well, what are all the alternatives that we have? What are our choices, and which one is the best choice among all of these different options? And I think that having that opportunity to ask that question will change the way in which planning is done if it's applied well across the different needs of different countries and different river basins. So I think in that sense that the availability of a tool to do much more than a shall we build or shall we not build choice is absolutely critical for me. The second thing that I thought was very interesting in this project was the combination of research communities and practitioners. And I am very grateful to colleagues in Ghana and in the Nile and in Myanmar and in Jordan, although I haven't had the opportunity to go to Jordan, to buy into the ideas put forward by a set of researchers who don't always speak exactly the same language as the politicians, the decision makers, and those who are trying to meet the development needs of local people who have a whole range of demands, from energy right through to food and fisheries and navigation and so forth. But for those of you who saw us coming 4 years ago and who said, yes, we want to talk to you, yes, we want to discuss with you how we can do things better, I think that's been one of the huge benefits of this interaction over the years. And I hope very much that the practitioners have been able to get their heads around the logic of the research community, which is not always the same logic as the practitioner community, and actually take some benefit from those interactions. And perhaps the group will hear a bit more about those during the day as different partners share their experience. Perhaps lastly, I'd just say that one of the things that has yet again been shown in our project is how challenging it is to do both engineering and technical work and social, environmental, and political economy work. We all know from observing systems that we've been involved with around the world that these disciplines don't always combine very effectively. And I think that we have shown that again in FutureDAMS, is that even with the best will in the world in a team that is committed to finding bridges and working together, it's very hard to put social and environmental and ecosystem concerns into modeling software in the same way that you can do with a lot of the engineering and the hard numbers side of things, if you like. The soft nature of environment and ecosystem planning and the complexities that don't lend themselves to numerical solutions makes it much more difficult to get judgments based on the quality of those issues. How important is it to avoid resettlement? How important is it not to impact on wetlands and hippopotamuses and fisheries and things like this? Is a value judgment that needs to be reserved for the communities that are affected and can't really be done remotely through statistical modeling, even though we can, of course, help with that by providing some information and some evidence that would help communities decide. So while we have a stakeholder guide in place, I think that we have shown just how challenging it is, once again, to bring together all those disciplines in a single process. So having said all that, I hope that you have some fruitful discussions, and I look forward to seeing the recording of this meeting, even if I can't be with you during the day. And I hope very much that you'll bring forward your own lessons and share those with the partners here. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, yeah, no, well, we directors have had the chance to put our oar in and to talk about what we've learned and some of the challenges that we've faced. We're now going to move on to partners to talk about ideally just 2 or 3 key findings that they've had or key messages that they take from the research and the capacity development that we've been undertaking. And I'm trying to look if I can spot if there's any particular way that these can be understood or presented in the future. But please, all of you, if you can spot some pattern or some emerging theme which is totally overriding, then do make sure that you point that out to us when we move to comments and question and answers. We're going to start then with Alex Cesena Martinez, who is at the Department of Electrical and Electronic Engineering at Manchester. Alex, can we give you your 3 minutes?
Okay, perfect. Okay, so my name is Alejandro Martinez Cesena. Alex, I'm just going to be presenting some key findings from the energy team. The energy team has changed quite a bit in its latest iteration. It was led by myself and Dr. Mateos Panteli and Professor Mancarella. Mateos is now in Cyprus. Pierluigi is now in Australia. And we had quite a few PDRAs in the work. Going straight to the key findings, the important things to discuss for us. One of the key themes or things that we kept seeing in the studies was that there is definitely additional value in the interactions between the sectors, and that's kind of straightforward because I'm an electrical engineer. So if my perspective as an undergrad, as an MSc, was that everything has to be solved with electricity, with power. And as you learn more things, you realize that there's a lot of limitations with the things you can do with just your sector. So just the idea that you can look outside of your field, outside of energy, opens up a lot of possibilities about options that you can explore. So now it's not only about you have to electrify everything if you want to decarbonize. You have to rely purely on intermittent renewables to tackle the issues. Now you actually can see a lot of options in other sectors, in this case coming from water. Understanding the availability of water, can we get more water? Can we do with fewer water if that allows us to get more in the future? Now, the problem is, even though this gives us new options, let's say new forms to integrate renewables, more value, it's not that straightforward because the models that we already have in our sector are quite complex. The models that are available in other fields, in water management, are also quite complicated on their own. So integrating these models is not an easy task. Just understanding how these models work is not an easy task. So there is the need to have this discussion between experts from different fields just to understand how things work. And because of the complexity, we need to do some trade-offs between the level of accuracy that we want to have for each of these models and the type of study that we want to do. So if we're doing an operational study, we might be willing to take a lot of detail from every sector because these are models that we're running only a few times. But if we're doing a heavy simulation-based optimization, we might have to do some trade-offs regarding the level of accuracy for our models. Otherwise, these models would be running forever and we won't be able to get meaningful information in time. So overall, that's basically what we saw from the energy side. There's a lot of value in these interactions, but it's not easy to tackle. There has to be some discussions to be made between different stakeholders, and there have to be some trade-offs between the level of details and the accuracy that we want to get from these models. And hopefully the information, the models, the websites that have been set up by the team would set those foundations for people to start discussing these trade-offs between different models, between different studies. And with that, I'm assuming I've already spent all my time, so I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Let's move on then to our partner in Ghana, Emmanuel Obobi, who's been leading the team from the CSIR in Accra. Over to you, Emmanuel.
Okay, thank you, David, and thanks to everyone online. As already mentioned by some of the earlier speakers, FutureDAMS started with a very big ambition. And for those of us in the basin, specifically the Volta Basin, having participated in the previous project that was sort of partly a continuation into the FutureDAMS, we had quite very huge ambition, just as the project itself had. And those were to, as much as possible, integrate all the different sectors, water, food, energy, environment, and to have this approach or tool that stakeholders can use together to help with decisions and investment planning in these sectors. And indeed, largely, the project succeeded especially for the energy water integration component, and then also some part of the economic integration. Unfortunately, there was not that much opportunity to have a stronger integration from the food sector or the agri sector, which we very much had hoped for, to have that as part of the entire system integration.
I think we may have lost the link with Emmanuel, but we move on to Tim Foster now, who works in mechanical and civil engineering at Manchester, but specializes in water food security. Tim, your 3 minutes.
Thanks, David. I don't have any specific slides, and I sort of don't want to sort of dwell on specific kind of research project findings, just to kind of share a few lessons from our sort of agriculture economics focused team. I think the first of those was really that a lot of the work on dams has, I think, historically and to a certain extent through parts of this project and ongoing activities, focused very much on the question of sort of design and selection, and there's been a lot less focus both in practice and in research on the aspects of post-project monitoring and evaluation. And certainly from the agricultural sector, that's one of the key things that we found through our research, is that many of the agricultural components of dams simply never really end up achieving what they set out to do, and there's a variety of reasons for that. But the really kind of a lesson for going forward is a need for much greater focus on checking whether projects are actually delivering on what they originally stated, and if not, building lessons into future projects about setting more realistic expectations and thinking through why some of those issues of underperformance have arisen. Particularly on the second point, particularly from our sort of work in sub-Saharan Africa and in West Africa, I think recognizing that a lot of the irrigation development activities are occurring outside of the domain of large dams and large-scale water infrastructure systems, and primarily being driven by sort of bottom-up farmer-led initiatives, that many of those actually seem to be quite efficient and cost-effective means of improving agricultural water security for farmers, but that they pose challenges for the broader water, energy, food, environment nexus planning, because we often don't know a lot about where they are, or how they're developing, or how they're impacting on other parts of the wider water resource system. So I think some of the areas that we've ended up spending a lot more time than we perhaps originally envisaged were a lot on the kind of the monitoring of and developing of data sets to track agricultural development and irrigation activities within catchments, and we hope that there'll still be opportunities to look at building some of that back into the modeling as we go forward. And I guess just a sort of a final point in that realistically, I think going forward, what we're going to need to think about is how we take, on the agriculture side, take the benefits of big dams and large-scale water infrastructures and the storage and the kind of the buffering capacity against climate variability, and put that together with some of the perhaps more farmer-facing small-scale initiatives that are actually quite different and happening outside of the domain of large-scale dams and water infrastructure systems. So I think those were kind of our key sort of lessons and points from work that was particularly focused in Ghana and West Africa.
Okay, thanks very much, Tim, for getting us to think about the water-food relationship there. We're now going to have a video clip from Kevin Narasimhan from the University of Surrey, who works at the Centre for Research in Social Simulation.
Hello, I'm Dr. Kevin Narasimhan. I was a research fellow in the FutureDAMS project based at the Centre for Research in Social Simulation at the University of Surrey. My FutureDAMS colleagues and I took a social simulation approach to explore the impact of community-based water management in sub-Saharan Africa. Decentralized water management is central to irrigation expansion efforts in sub-Saharan Africa, and it broadly means water allocation and supply is handled within local communities, with occasional or no technical and financial support from external actors once the project is live. Water user associations, or WEFE in short, are semi-formal or informal arrangements for operationalizing decentralized water management, with a focus on allocating water to users, dealing with operation and maintenance tasks, collecting fees and fines, and resolving conflicts among water users. Previous research and initial scoping work showed that WEFE often struggle to fulfill their mandates, and a strong need to understand why this might be and how WEFE could improve their performance and outputs. We developed an agent-based model called Watering, which stands for Water User Associations at the interface of Nexus governance, as a tool to explore and plan community-level water management. We hope the model will allow its users to understand and explain the combined influence of WEFE policies and community participation on water use and income earned within an irrigation scheme. The agents in Watering are farmers, pastoralists, households, and one WEFE agent, and the environment is a simulated irrigation scheme. Watering also has a social environment whereby neighboring water users influence one another. Watering was co-developed and evaluated by stakeholders through a series of knowledge exchange events. Some of the findings based on our watering simulations are: if unregulated water use is a challenge within an irrigation scheme which the WEFE cannot adequately control, then the WEFE and its members would both be better off in terms of income generated if WEFE is not too restrictive in rationing water supply to its members. WEFE earns more if upstream water users are not prioritized over downstream water users when allocating water. If damages caused by livestock to the irrigation scheme, that is, be it to the crops or infrastructure, cannot be controlled effectively, then WEFE membership, being exclusive to crop farmers, works better when WEFE can successfully recover fines from pastoralists to compensate the loss faced by farmers. On the other hand, if livestock damage is not an issue, then WEFE membership, being inclusive of crop farmers, pastoralists, that is large livestock keepers, and households, is a better membership arrangement for the WEFE and its water users. WEFE member farmers also have higher yield productivity compared to non-member farmers and non-irrigators. But non-irrigators are economically more active in the long term as they have less to no water use costs. Since this has been a whistle-stop tour, I'm linking here a video which fully explains our approach and findings for those interested. We have already released 2 building blocks of watering as open source code. I'm also linking the code repositories here. We are soon also hoping to make the entire watering model available, free and open source.
Okay, and we'll be, I think, as I said at the beginning, we'll be sending all of the slides to all of those of you who are registered. So if you want to get those links and chase them up, you'll get that in 2 or 3 days' time, probably. It's interesting with we've talked about the challenges of interdisciplinarity, and certainly I know Julian and colleagues at Surrey have been trying to scratch their heads to work out how micro modeling and macro modeling can fit together, and have found that a very big challenge. Okay, we're now going to move on to Mohammed Bashir, who is one of our research associates at the School of Engineering, and who's particularly been working on the Nile Basin. Mohammed, over to you.
Thank you very much. So within FutureDAMS, we here at the Water Resources Group of the University of Manchester, together with University College London Economics team, and Newcastle University Climate team, and Southampton University Hydrology team, we work together on developing a framework that connects engineering-based river system models with economy-wide models driven by some of the latest climate data that propagate through the hydrology system into the river system. We try to pay quite a bit of attention to how these different modeling components are connected in a way that makes sure we've got coherent assumptions within all models, that if one component of the modeling framework runs under certain assumptions, all other components follow. And I think we've been quite successful in doing that. We're hoping that this modeling framework can help us evaluate interventions in river systems and macroeconomies, help us understand and evaluate which kind of interventions to make and when to make them, especially given the quite non-stationarity in the natural and economic systems. The Nile Basin has been kind of our lab for developing this framework. We've done quite a few experiments there. We've done some studies on transboundary management of the Nile water resources using this integrated modeling framework. And but perhaps the one thing that we kind of take away from all these analysis is that you know, in these transboundary river basins, you know, the transboundary nature is even it's another layer of complexity that we need to take into account very carefully when we look at such systems. And one thing that we saw from our results is that cooperation between countries is always beneficial and can help kind of widen the solution space and provide win-win solutions. One last thing that I want to mention, perhaps something that I even learned throughout FutureDAMS is, and it's something that FutureDAMS I think invested in quite a bit, is how to interact with stakeholders. And I think from a modeling perspective, we've been quite actively interacting with our partners in East Africa. In some cases, we had even weekly meetings with them, looking at technical aspects, understanding their demands, and adapting our model development approaches to accommodate their demands, but also making sure that they are part of the model development process, so that it's easier for them to adopt models later on after the project finishes. It remains open, and we'll see over the next weeks and perhaps months and years whether this approach was successful, and will help stakeholders, you know, take these models forward and create some social value based on these models. But I think that approach is something that we could learn from, and we could look at in all future water, energy, food, environment Nexus initiatives. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mohammed. Okay, we're going to move on now to Cambridge, to Judith Plummer-Brakeman, who's a senior research associate at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, and has particularly spearheaded our work on finance. Judith, over to you.
Thanks very much, David, and great to see everybody after a long time. I think the key takeaways from the finance section were particularly about how important it is to make that bridge between academia and practice. And one of the first things we did was to write a guide to terminology, which explained what financiers mean by particular terms. And I've been surprised by how valuable that piece has been, though it really seemed like just a sort of a building block to our research. It's actually become one of the most downloaded bits of our research. The other thing was about how we create projects, how projects are financed, making sure there's a really strong understanding of that, because there's an awful lot said about the way projects should be financed. And it's remarkable how many people have got very strong views on the way they should be financed, but not quite such clear views on how they can be financed. And those two things proved to be quite a long distance apart. I think the other key deliverable was we analysed risk from the point of view of financiers. And really that has been quite successful. And we've now been asked by the World Bank to pilot that on one of their projects, with the aim of getting that as to be something they do on each of their projects to assess the risk and the suitability for finance. So that's really good. There was one other thing I wanted to mention, which I think is an interesting development I see in hydropower. And it's happened largely over the period that we've done FutureDAMS. And that is the change from we have to do the minimum damage projects, which are run of river, which was probably the prevailing message maybe 10 years ago, to a rapid realization in the last 5 years that actually storage has a huge role to play in providing balancing power for renewable energy, and therefore the importance of pump storage. And I feel as though pump storage is somewhat the kind of orphan child of the hydropower sector. It's always mentioned as a sort of add-on, and but it has now become absolutely crucial to the management of many of the grids around the world. And it's almost as though pump storage has come into its own, which is interesting because pump storage can be not connected to the rest of the water system, which I think makes it a very special case. So that's my 3 minutes, and thank you very much indeed, all of you.
Okay, thanks, Judith. And if any of you are ever confused by finance, then do take a look at that sort of glossary and explanation of just key concepts in finance that Judith has produced. I certainly have found that very useful when people are blinding me with the science of finance. We now move on to Solomon Gabre-Chorkos, who's in Geography and Environmental Science at the University of Southampton, has been working with the team there. Solomon, your 3 minutes.
Thank you, David. So it was really a pleasure working for the project for the last 3 years. And as a hydrologist working for this project, I have learned a lot about the changes in drivers in hydrology and hydrological extremes in the case studies, and working with project partners and on a team, how this speed ups the process in developing and sharing data sets. For example, like working with Newcastle was a very rewarding job, and model calibration with the Manchester was also very helpful. But I just want to share one slide, if that's okay. Yeah, if you can see this slide. So this is one of our modeling work we did for the case studies for the Nile and Volta, but we did extended the work for the whole of Africa. And we've been trying to understand what is driving floods. And so the floods were not really mainly driven by the precipitation extremes that we always think, but largely by the wet antecedent conditions. So we looked at this over more than 700,000 river reaches. And then if you look at the smaller graphs here in the Volta Basin, most of the precipitation extremes do not really match with the floods. but mainly like about 30% of the precipitation extremes happen before the flood event is. And this is also similar what we found on over the Nile Basin. Most of the precipitation extremes happens before the flood is, like maybe with a lag time of 30 to 40 days. So this indicates that the floods are mainly driven by the wet antecedent condition, by the average precipitation, by the soil moisture and other local characteristics, but it's not mainly by the precipitation extremes. So we're developing this as a model. We are trying to extend this model further to this project to include what we have missed in our model, that's the human activities, which I have developed a proposal and I'm submitting into a 3-year fellowship to the University of Southampton for funding. And if that happens, so I will continue to work with the FutureDAM case studies to continue working on the hydrology and climate part of the project. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Solomon. Okay, we're going to move over to Barnaby now, who's a research fellow at the University of Manchester and particularly been involved in looking at the politics and the political economy and at times at the international relations of investments in dam and water management schemes. Barnaby, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, so I sort of didn't want to focus on the project outcomes, the research outcomes we've had, but just thinking more about sort of what I've learned through the project. And I think really it's taught me something about the politics of modeling. I mean, as a political scientist, you sort of find politics wherever you go. But as we've heard, there's been this sort of big advance in computing, and as Jamie was saying, this has sort of answered a gap that perhaps existed before in sort of being able to understand technically the different relationships between water, food, environment systems. And so I think that's quite powerful. But there's two sort of, I think, particularly political issues that were doing these sort of approaches involves. And the first is around access to data. And this has been, this is sort of seems to have been a challenge for various points in the project, but also clearly these sorts of models rely on being able to access good data. But in many developing country contexts, these are obviously closely guarded secrets. In the sort of UK, European, American context, there's not so much fear of data disclosure, and there is this trust between the state and civil society, but is quite different. But in a developing country context where you don't have that level of trust, or where there's just sort of a lot of sort of tension and conflict between different countries, there's very strong reasons, there's good rationales for countries trying to keep their data very private. And I mean, the Nile Basin case study is perhaps one of the best ones that we as a project have been working in. And I think that poses questions around sort of the global inequality, perhaps in where some of this types of technology can be done. But there's also a sort of intersecting of that a data reliability question. And I think working in our sort of European, mostly European context, we're very used to, when we get access to data, trusting it. But especially since the 1980s, and especially in the African context, actually, sort of big austerity measures have really had major repercussions on the collection of data, on government statistics departments, on academia more broadly. And so there are big questions of the reliability of data in a lot of countries. And you also have political economy contexts where you have to, as a civil servant, you might be more incentivized to report the right number to your seniors as opposed to the accurate number. But of course, this can have huge distortions then if we're using this data for our own modeling purposes. And I think again, well, sort of in the FutureDAMS thing, I think we've often talked about gaps in knowing exactly where people are in things like having really detailed topography, so that down to the meter where a reservoir is going to be, and also just sort of where species are, different indigenous species. And it's hardly surprising that a lot of dam studies have turned up indigenous species in developing countries, because a lot of these parts of the world haven't been mapped as well, and there isn't as much knowledge of exactly what is where. So I think this sort of speaks to sort of important global differences in how these modeling processes work, and some of the politics in trying to undertake them. And the other one that David and I have focused on more is the politics of who controls the modeling process. What is measured, what values does the computer produce? And I think essentially this is a political project of deciding some of those factors and deciding the value judgments that go into the modeling process. And this is because it touches on a lot of different people's livelihoods. It involves decisions about big resources, or for example, how to judge the natural world and ecosystems that exist. And so because it's a sort of political project, there's, I guess again, from our sort of European Western perspective, we have an idea that this should really be as inclusive and participatory as possible in order for it to have the best outcomes. And so, David and I have put together the guide, which has a way of sort of laying this out in a relatively stakeholder-focused, participatory way. But of course, that's going to be a very political thing to try and implement. And certainly in our own FutureDAMS project, this isn't something we've tried to do in our work in Ghana, even, or on the Nile and Jordan and Myanmar. And so I sort of am left feeling somewhat wary of some of these water food energy models. I think there's an important technical advance that they can make, but there's also an ability for them to be controlled by ruling elites and not be used for the purposes of inclusive development. They can also give a sort of badge of approval and justification to projects that may not have very just outcomes. And so I think there's always that sort of danger we have to keep in mind when thinking about them. I've enjoyed working on the project. It's been interesting, and I just wanted to thank Tom, who I've been working on the politics stream with, and our 12 team members in Ghana, Ethiopia, and India, who have done really great work, which is coming out as working papers as we speak, and also in some top journal articles, and hopefully also an edited book soon. So thanks.
Thanks very much, Barnaby. And the final presentation now, and then we'll open it up for the audience, is by Richard Palmer-Jones, who's a emeritus professor at the University of East Anglia. Richard's been looking particularly at India, and particularly looking at the ex-post economic analysis, but what historically have dams actually produced. A lot of our work's been looking forward, but Richard's been focused on understanding what has been happening with historical assets. Richard, can I put it over to you?
Okay.
Yep.
So we have a fairly small project which started off with Kunal Sen and Vegard Iversen, but actually I've done most of the work on it. And it was examining a well-known paper by some prominent economists, which purported to assess the impact of dams in India using the analysis of district-level data. And it was quite widely, it's been quite widely referenced, and one of the authors is a Nobel Prize winner in economics. I hope I'm going to be able to show you the next screen. Okay, yeah. So what are the three big things? I'm really only coming to the end of this project now because it's been a struggle for various reasons. Firstly, in this paper, it's characterized by mistaken hydrology, mistakes about understanding irrigation and agricultural sciences. It's got many mistakes of that type. It also has gross errors in data, including some of the key variables which establish the econometric credentials of the results, which are actually hiding in plain sight. So there's a map which shows the average river slopes in India, which clearly is at odds with what everybody knows about the topology and topography of India. You just have to look at it and you'll see it. And it also employs obscure econometrics, which on careful examination appear to show that the data violate the assumptions on which the methods are based. The headline findings of the paper was that dams have negative effects in the districts in which they are placed, but positive effects, some positive effects in downstream districts. And this was held to be quite critical of dams at a time when there was widespread activism and academic interest in opposition to the construction of large dams. But what I want to say, from having examined this paper and its methods very carefully, is that you can't say that from that paper. That paper does not allow you to say either of those things. So what we've been doing over the last 2.5 years especially is try to see if there's a convincing way in which you can analyze the impacts of dams in India using district level data. So that's quite a narrow thing. I have to say that, as the Irishman said, I wouldn't have started from there. But since we did start from there, what could we learn? So with more convincing science about hydraulic agricultural irrigation realities, using correct data, and transparent econometrics using standard off-the-shelf procedures, we can say, I think, and I only really came to this conclusion in the last month, that dams probably have some benefits in districts that are downstream of those dams, but only provided they have the potential for irrigated agriculture, and that this irrigated potential has been developed or is developed at some time to exploit the resources that are made available. I would say that no quantitative implications can be used. So the attempt to try and use what I found to feed into economic cost benefit analysis would seem to be extremely unsatisfactory, not useful, not sensible to do. I can also say that there's probably no discernible negative effect of dams in the districts in which they are located. And this, of course, doesn't mean that they don't have negative effects, but that they're just not discernible by these methods. And what was found and reported in dams, which is quite a robust finding, is probably due to the fact that their econometrics completely fail to control for confounding factors, which accounted for those districts being rather...
Last 30 seconds, Richard.
Anyhow, so the final takeaway is something that I probably knew already, and that is that the so-called credibility revolution in applied economics is simply incredible, and especially if you're not careful about data and you're careless about the econometrics.
Okay, thank you very much. All that glitters is not gold. Nobel Prize winners are very, very good researchers, but they can make mistakes. Okay, thanks very much for that. I mean, probably necessary now. We've just got 2 or 3 minutes left to pull things together. So I thought I'd give you a sparkling synthesis of what 70 researchers and capacity developers have produced over 4.5 years. But actually, I haven't got a sparkling synthesis because, as you've seen, there are a lot of findings about different areas, and many of those, the findings are actually contested by different researchers as to what might be a better way forward or not. Certainly just looking at the points that have been repeated there quite a lot, we've certainly recognized, as we knew at the beginning, and it's continued through, that one can strive for interdisciplinarity, but it is very difficult to achieve. We did, in a way, have a successful situation, certainly in getting the electronic and electricity engineers and the water management engineers to work together. And we've made real progress on the model in that. But it is interesting to see that social scientists may say engineers and natural scientists as having similar interests, but how distinct at times disciplinary boundaries can be within the hard sciences. That finding which Mohammed mentioned about international cooperation, the possibility of win-win negotiations, certainly came through very strongly to me, and particularly if one is looking at the multiple ways in which water can be managed, whether that is to generate electricity or to provide irrigation or to reduce floods or for broader socio-economic purposes. And it does look as though if one could foster more effective thinking about the different packages that different countries could have and how those might be put together, that could be beneficial, but very difficult to do that. The pump storage, I think, was very interesting because pump storage is emerging, certainly in some circles, as this solution to the problem of grid stability and base load, but certainly Bill's and other comments about the the difficulties of doing that. Certainly Jamie Skinner, who couldn't be with us, was very keen on the idea of pump storage, but very alarmed by the idea of not having regular flows or predictable flows of water downstream, and how you could have livelihoods downstream if there isn't some cycle, both daily and perhaps monthly and seasonal in that. If I was to look for one overarching conclusion, and for me it is that there are two very different processes here. I think that have been, in a way, technical and analytical advances, and certainly the modeling now is so much better now. Supercomputers are accessible, and one can begin to replicate some of the complexity of the systems that are looked at. I mean, how modelers used to get away with it 20 years ago, I don't know, because quite clearly those models were just like children's toys when you're actually looking for something sophisticated. But nowadays, I mean, that there have been technical advances. With data, then potentially great advances in getting access to data and being able to transmit it, in being able to get it from remote and from satellite areas. But also we've got the new technical problems that face, and certainly climate change has removed the old assumption that used to be logical, but it was possible technically to assume that the last 50 years, well, the next 50 years, we can assume reasonably that it'll be like the last 50 years of rainfall and temperature. And that is no longer reasonable nowadays to assume that. And so that's a great sort of challenge for technical modeling in that, in that way. On the political side, then things definitely probably, according to the work we've done, have slipped a bit, and the belief in the third wave of democratization from 1990 and the fact that civil societies would be empowered and accountability would improve around the world. Clearly the last 10 years have challenged that very deeply, with the rise of neo-populism, the sort of big man politics that we've moved into, and also the miracle of the internet, which was to ensure, in a way, analyzed when I first came across it, that all citizens could get accountability because they could see what's happening. But somehow we've ended up with ideas about fake news, and somehow sometimes fake news is fake. Sometimes probably the best facts available are painted as though they're fake by those who don't like the data that we're getting. So we do appear to be potentially have increased technical capacity to come up with better decisions, but politically maybe move towards a much lower capacity to want to take advantage of technical analysis and of the science that is available there. But the final word is to thank all of you who've come to this, all of you who've been partners, and partners, please can you stay on, because we want to say farewell to you because this is the last event, but also to thank those of you who've come into the webinars, who came into the seminars originally, who've supported us throughout, sometimes in terms of giving us advice about where to get data, about how to model things better, about how to kind of come up with useful lessons, and some of you who've been able to amplify the messages and the training that we've been providing. If I can say thank you to all of you on behalf of the entire partnership. And it's a big partnership, but we've really appreciated the way in which people have listened to what we've said and then challenged us and pushed our thinking forward. So thank you very much.